most innovative and nimble think tanks in Washington. A word about how I became involved with the American Security Project. It was because then Senator John Kerry came to me in 2006 and told me that his experience in the presidential campaign had taught him that our foreign policy had gotten far too partisan and far too politicized. And his goal was to try to fix that in a small way by creating a think tank. He did it along with a man named Chuck Hagel, who I think has also got a pretty good job these days, with the notion of putting together a think tank that would represent Republicans, would represent Democrats, and then would be anchored by retired military flag officers, such as some of the gentlemen that we've seen here, who would help us understand the military realities, the nonpartisan, hard military facts that underlay partisan foreign policy. And that has been the hallmark of the American Security Project since. And so I'm proud that we're putting on this program. Obviously, it's one that has attracted attention, emotion, and feeling. And that's the sort of program that ASP likes to put on. So thank you for being here. We're changing the focus now in this panel, and Amr Moussa, I'm told, is on the way, and we'll be speaking just after we conclude our panel in an hour or so. We're switching the focus now from the security side, from the geopolitical side, to the economic side. What is it that it will take? What does Egypt need? What does the economy need? What do those who are looking for work in Egypt need? What can a country like Egypt hope to do economically at a time when there is political and civil strife, such as we've seen in the country? What can the international community do to help Egypt find its economic footing and give them the space to work out political issues in the right manner? And that's the purpose of this panel. Let me introduce my fellow panelists down the line. We've got people who are both from outside Egypt and inside Egypt to give you a 360 on the economy and what might be done to help spur it. To my left is Dante Disparte. Dante is is managing director of Clements Worldwide, which is a leading risk management firm and is in the insurance sector. He and his colleagues help companies and help investors understand the risk in various markets and geographies. And so he'll give us his perspective on how economists and others measure risk in a country like Egypt and how they advise companies to factor that in. To his left is Basil El Baz, and Basil is, we're grateful to him not just for being on this panel, but for being the one to conceive of this conference in the first place and to not only develop the idea, but help us secure the funding to help put on a serious and a broad-based panel here in Washington, D.C. to discuss this whole broad range of issues. Basil is a graduate of Harvard University, as is Dante. I attended another school a little bit to the south. I'll try not to hold it against either of them for their ties. But Basil comes from a very successful commercial and economic background in Egypt. He's chairman and CEO of Carbon Holdings. He has successfully developed and financed 2 major industrial greenfield projects in Egypt, the Egypt Basic Industries Corporation, EBIC, and the Egypt Hydrocarbon Corporation, EHC. EBIC is the only project in Egypt to receive a comprehensive loan guarantee from the Export-Import Bank of the United States. I note that with some pride because for the last 2 years I was chair of EXIM's advisory committee, and we advised on matters throughout the world, including the Middle East. So your project is really a signal one, Basil. He is someone who is not only personally invested in Egypt, but is someone who is helping to connect Egypt to the outside world in conferences like this, and also by reaching out to the World Bank, EXIM, and others to assure them of the economic situation in Egypt. So we're delighted to have you here, Basil, to give us the inside perspective on matters in the country. We also, next to him, we have Mustafa Abdel Wadoudi, who is with the Abraj Group. And Abraj, as most of you know, is one of the premier investment firms. It focuses heavily on the Mideast, very specialized, and he is someone who, in addition to being chairman of the Management Executive Committee, is someone who knows the Mideast well, has traveled broadly in the region. He was a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, and he'll bring the regional perspective on Egypt. And at the far left, we have Khush Chosky, and he is giving us the international business perspective. He's Vice President for Turkey, the Middle East, and North African Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He is the Executive Director of the U.S.-Egypt Business Council, the U.S. Bahraini Business Council. He was formerly with Comonix International, where he worked on building economic ties between the U.S. and the Middle East. And so he'll give that important perspective. We'll move down the row. I've asked each of our panelists to give us an opening statement, give his views on the situation. I'll begin a conversation, and then we'll bring the audience into it. With that, let me turn it over to Dante Disparte with Clements Worldwide. Dante?
Thank you. Let me just steal this microphone here real quick. Thanks Nelson for the kind introduction, and thank you to the American Security Project and to Basil for conceiving of this idea. I think it's an excellent discussion that we've had so far, and an emotive one. Lots of passion that we've seen in the first few roundtables or panel discussions this morning. The interesting thing I think about an economic discussion is that no matter what side of the political spectrum you sit on, economics punish equally. So my first engagement with the American Security Project was last summer with the Dr. Michael Porter from Harvard Business School and others, where we were talking about American competitiveness. And similarly, when you discuss the situation in Egypt from the vantage point of risk, from the vantage point of job creation, from the vantage point of economics, you simply have to look at it with a lens that is as apolitical as possible, because the truth of the matter is the only way forward for the Egyptian economy and for the Egyptian stability, I think that everybody is discussing earlier this morning or this afternoon, is an economic path. There is no other alternative. So my firm, just for background's sake, we specialize in providing insurance and related risk management solutions. We currently have clients in more than 180 countries. And so when things are blowing up around the world and when the worst possible things that are occurring reaches the headline news, it's typically a firm like mine that has either helped people address those situations. So we always say that you cannot buy insurance when the house is on fire. You have to worry about it well after the fact. So taking sort of this view on Egypt, the key thing is to define risk versus uncertainty. Risk you can always quantify, right? So when you think about it in an economic sense, when you think about it in the context of a market, you could put a price on it, you can quantify it. Uncertainty you cannot. And right now the broad sort of view on the Egyptian economy and in particular sort of the situation locally in the market in terms of job creation is an uncertain one, and so everything has come to a standstill. And I think it behooves the Egyptian system, the public, the people, to really figure out a pathway forward, because the reality of the situation that it's in is it punishes equally. Whatever side of the political spectrum you sit on, this downward spiral that Egypt is sort of working its way through doesn't recognize sides. So I prepared my remarks specifically around the private sector, and then looking at it from a macro vantage point, and then ultimately what are some of the solutions that are being offered, not only at an international level to coax foreign direct investment back into Egypt, but also sort of regionally and locally, and what are some of the potential solutions wherein you could hedge uncertainty, hedge risk, and make Egypt the attractive country that it is. I think in simple terms, Egypt would be investment grade, in the same way that international stock market advisors and investment pickers say, invest when the market is down. you simply have to take a similar view at a macro level when you discuss countries. So for one, the Egyptian economy at the sort of national level doesn't really have vibrant capital markets. The majority of firms operating in Egypt are literally living on their own cash flow, and there isn't sort of a vibrant capital market. Any economy that wants to create lots of jobs needs credit, effectively, to start fueling that growth, and that's something that's absent, broadly speaking, in the Egyptian economy. Similarly, the structure of enterprises in Egypt is such that the bottom micro enterprises with 4 or fewer employees account for about 58 to 60% of the entire workforce. Those SMEs need a voice. They need a process in the economy. They need to be able to participate because it accounts for such a large percentage of growth, job creation, and so on. And as a result, they need sort of a stake in what happens with the Egyptian economy from this point forward. And there's some solutions that are out there. For example, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, a US government institution, is offering support. The Obama administration has pledged about $1 billion of support to spur SME lending and to sort of kickstart that bottom of the pyramid, which is where most jobs are created effectively, including in the United States. Similarly, those types of international organizations and my own firm specialize in providing insurance solutions that would cover real uncertainty, political risk, expropriation, nationalization, the type of thing political situation starts to clear. And in addition, I think from a sort of a high-level economic vantage point, Egypt needs to start hitting a stride, I think, as we heard in the last panel, where the economy is growing around 6 to 8%, just to absorb new entrants in the workforce. There's no pathway to stabilizing Egypt until you can start to see that job creation is happening at the broadest possible broadest base. And equally, firms that are commanding, in the Mubarak era that had very close relations to the government, I think the general view is that we need to start destigmatizing the perception among the Egyptian people that business is a part of the problem, and businesses need to take their own view on that. So there's a lot of investment that is just within Egypt, let alone foreign investment that isn't coming in, where the entire economy is at a standstill. At a macro level as well, Egypt has depleted its foreign reserves, and this is something that is a big issue. So historically, Egypt had around 35 billion on average in foreign reserves due to tourism, foreign direct investment, and other income flows. The number now is roughly about 15 to 12 billion, according to certain estimates. So that too puts much strain on the government, puts much strain on the economy. And I think probably the last and most important thing, especially to give the international investors a sense of understanding of what is happening in the Egyptian market, is that the military in particular is crowding out a lot of the local investment. Some estimates range between 20 and 40%. In some respects have military involvement in the private sector, and I think there has to be very clear rules of engagement. There has to be clear guidelines on that type of relationship between the private sector and the military. So, what are some of the solutions? Again, it's to spur growth at the base of the pyramid. So when you look at statistics, 5 to 10% of the smallest firms, what they call gazelles in sort of entrepreneurship and in business, typically account for between 50 and 80% of job creation. That type of job creation miracle is no less possible in a country like Egypt as it is in Silicon Valley. So maybe the Valley of the Kings becomes an entrepreneurship equivalent in the country, just to keep the imagery. But so part of the solution is really emphasizing a role for the private sector, giving a place and space in the Egyptian sort of dialogue about how do you create access, power, and all of the fun things that work in vibrant economies. That you do that at the grassroots level and give them investments. Stop crowding out the local credit markets, and engage with international sort of insurance and risk solutions that can help stabilize, normalize, and put a fixed price on uncertainty. But the simple word would be that, you know, Egypt, as it is, wouldn't be the type of country you could easily write off at any level, not regionally, not internationally. As an investor, I think it would be a big mistake.
Basil, over to you.
Thank you. So, I mean, I'll have to try to find some new subject matter now. I think you've covered quite a bit of everything.
I read your notes.
I think perhaps what I'd like to do is maybe tell what I would call, give a little bit of background on myself. Our company is a little bit different than others that you will typically see in Egypt for one particular reason. Our genesis was at a university. We are a university startup when I was here in the United States. And it was obviously an era in which multiple companies were being established in the dorm rooms. Every room was effectively a company, and this was the so-called dot-com era in the mid-90s. Having a desire to return back to my country and not being able to quite understand how the dot-coms would translate into physical products that the consumers could see, I felt it more prudent to enter into the industrial space. As a student, I had studied the Korean model, and to be quite frank, was impressed as to the transformation that this country had managed to go through. Many people forget that in the 1960s, South Korea was receiving financial aid from the Philippines. And this is a very important element because it tells you through reform, through structure, you can accomplish practically any economic goal. For us as a company, we went from one employee in the university to approximately 1,400 a decade later. And so I'd like to say we've had an explosive growth in terms of manpower. I was hoping that the revenue line would follow the same trajectory, but that seems to be somewhat behind it. When I take a look today at Egypt, and obviously some of the projects that we had done, the first one being financed entirely from the Export-Import Bank of the United States, was critical in the sense because it allowed me as a student, I was able to tap into the entrepreneurial vibe that existed here in the United States, and one that does not exist in my home country yet, and one that needs to be nurtured and one that needs to be encouraged. And I was able to put in place the bits and pieces that permitted such a project with a value of around $650 million to be executed. Because ultimately, if it makes sense, it is financeable. And if it is financeable from the lenders, it is investable from the equity side. And it was a puzzle that was put together, one that was replicated afterwards. The second project we did was perhaps extremely interesting, and I'm mentioning specific projects because each one had its own challenges. The first one, obviously, going into the local marketplace as an entrepreneur, 21 years old, something that the market is not used to seeing. The second project we did was a ammonium nitrate facility geared towards the mining sector, and it was scheduled to achieve financial close on the 31st of January 2011. Of course, as one could imagine, somewhere around the 28th or the 29th, one was holding on to the lenders, one was holding on to equity investors by their collars, by their shirts, and trying to keep them inside the room.
And taking away their BlackBerries.
And however, having done one project in such a complicated environment, being an entrepreneur, we had a structure that was extremely well balanced. One that permitted us to close in July of 2011. And that put us in a position in which, A, we became the largest investor in Egypt post-revolution. We became the first major project to close in Egypt post-revolution, and this is embarrassing. Mustafa, it's for you. We became the largest investor post-revolution, and we commenced construction of a somewhat substantial facility in the Governorate of Suez. And there has been a misconception that Egypt has been very, very difficult to work in over the past 3 years, over the past 4 years or 2 years or what have you. And the reality is the facility today is 92% complete. We have commenced commissioning of this plant, and our total delays to the project are anywhere between 45 to 60 days. And so ultimately, with discipline, you can navigate through any turbulent times. In looking at the Korean model that I studied, and we have an opportunity today where we are working with a South Korean company, I had an opportunity to sit with one of their government officials who began to tell me a story that I felt was extremely relevant. He told me a story in which he said, I understand in Egypt that your Ministry of Interior is structured like this with these different divisions. And diplomats in your foreign corps, they travel abroad for 4 years and then they'll return home for 2 years and then they'll get a different posting, and the countries are designated by categories, and so you can't go to too many nice countries after each other. At which point I responded and I said, you must have been, Sir, Your Excellency, you must have been a member of the diplomatic corps, the South Korean corps that was in Cairo. And he said, no. I was a junior member of the delegation that visited Egypt after the armistice with North Korea. And at that point in time, we were looking for a country that if we replicated their organizational chart, their government structure, and implemented it in our own country, maybe in 50 years, our economy can be the size of their economy. Because Egypt was 3 times the size of South Korea at that specific point. And so what this tells me is that the model we have could work. The issue we have is that we are not taking the decisions that we need to take to ensure that this model works. I've attended many conferences like this, and we all know the economic indicators, and we know that the foreign reserves have gone down, and we know that our currency is pegged to the dollar, so that when the reserves go down, pressure is put on the currency, and if the pressure is put on the currency, and everyone, I think, is familiar with this, but no one seems to address what I call the serious issue of Egypt. Because there is one issue, and it needs to be addressed, and that issue is employment. Where we are today, officially, you're looking at 13–14% unemployment, unofficially perhaps 20%. And there's a very simple political principle. You have it here in the United States. When unemployment begins to reach the 8% mark, the 9% mark, the elected official will be thrown out of his office in the next election. And if it continues for 4 years, the chief executive will be thrown out of his house as well. This is the reality. If we take a look at our population, 90 million people, if we take a look at our growth rate, 3%, 3.5%, 4%, I'm talking population growth now. And if you take a look that this population will reach 100 million in less than 5 years, it will reach 125 million, probably a decade after that, and it will continue growing at this exponential pace, you will find that we are not creating the employment opportunities that we must. How are we going to create these employment opportunities? Because this is ultimately what it comes down to. At the end of the day, the fundamentals exist to invest in Egypt. Skilled workforce, both blue collar and white collar. One of the very simple examples is the facilities that we own and operate are constructed by Egyptians. We do not have the situation in which expatriate labor forces must be brought in from various parts of the world to do the construction activities, which means that you have a real economy. What we have lacked is investment. What we have lacked is the economic reforms that are necessary to facilitate this kind of investment. Because it is only through private sector investment that you will be able to create jobs. This is the only way that we will tackle the basic issue of unemployment. Because ultimately, you can have the best infrastructure, the best schools, you can have an abundant supply of power that never gets cut off. But if there is no job from 9 to 5, the citizen will not be happy. Whereas, if he is busy from 9 to 5, but the rest is coming, the citizen will be patient. The citizen will hope that through the ballot box he can elect the official that will pay attention to the basic infrastructure requirements that are necessary to allow him to live his life. I'm someone who holds a very optimistic view of the future, and those of you that know me can probably attest to that. I'm always positive irrespective of what's taking place. The reason for this positive attitude is that the fundamentals are in place. We just need to figure out how to take advantage of these fundamentals. I was fortunate enough that I was able to do it on a micro scale with an individual country, with an individual company. And my hope is that with our relationship in the United States, what I would like to see more of is an education on entrepreneurship at a wide scale. Because ultimately, to address the issue of liquidity to the SMEs, an SME, by definition, is a highly entrepreneurial venture. It is one person, two people, three people, four people, where it starts. And there has to be an understanding of the risk involved in setting up this venture. And more importantly, there has to be the infrastructure around the SME to enable the individual to go ahead and to take that first step. From my perspective, what did I do? I submitted an application to the United States Trade and Development Agency for funding for a feasibility study for a project that could, if successful, generate tremendous US exports. That is what the agency is there for. We need to look at establishing the same sorts of agencies in Egypt to assist those college graduates, to assist those high school students who elect not to pursue a higher education but want to join the workforce immediately. This is what I would hope we focus on to a certain extent with the United States, because ultimately, if this issue is not addressed, I can assure you that we will keep having a circular
context. Just our own perspective. We have been, in fact, very active in Egypt and the Middle East, but we are a global investor across emerging markets. So we're present everywhere from Latin America to Southeast Asia with probably, we've made 200 investments across these markets. And what that does is it gives us context around what markets that people naturally perceive as risky. We've been investing primarily in what people see as not even the emerging markets, but the frontier markets, and we've been doing so for over a decade. And Egypt has been actually, interestingly enough, one of our most sort of, somewhere where we've had one of our most successful track records. And Egypt is somewhere where we've been investing in, pre-January 25th, post-January 25th, post-June 30th, and we continue to invest. Obviously, there are challenges around the environment. We feel Egypt does not deliver on its full potential because we do well there, but Egypt can deliver so much more. But I think there are also a set of harsh realities, and one of the challenges around Egypt is, generally speaking, people don't acknowledge within Egypt the economic realities of the situation, because it will be a difficult journey, regardless of the political leadership that comes into power at any point in time in these upcoming elections. I think there's significant economic challenges. And whereas we're going through a political transition, and a rather bumpy one, there is some very harsh realities around the economics. I mean, we alluded to some, my colleagues here on the panel talked about the challenges around employment. The numbers are challenging. 1 million people are coming into the job market approximately every single year, and that needs a 7% growth rate. We're not hitting that growth rate. The last time we hit that growth rate was actually pre-revolution, ironically enough. And that's the growth rate you need to just maintain unemployment at current levels. And current levels are not very good. For the past 3 years, there's been very little in the way of actual investment. And with the lack of investment, you're not creating the opportunity for jobs. So actually, the situation is much more challenging. So reality number one is there's a lot of long-term challenges around the economy, around growth, around employment, and in my personal view, primarily around education. Reality number two is the modest growth rates that we're seeing right now are inadequate for providing either employment or reducing poverty. That's a very, very harsh reality as well. And reality number three, again, is the ironic point I referred to, is they have actually deteriorated over the past few years. And the outlook actually remains quite uncertain, going to your point around risk versus uncertainty. And that uncertainty is a big challenge. And I think it's a natural transition. Now, on the bright side, according to a number of studies, Egypt is going through the same political transformation and transition that a lot of various countries that we look to today as successful examples, such as South Africa or Turkey or other economies that we see as symbols of economic growth and to a certain degree some level of stability. Egypt is going through that transition to a certain extent. So I am, like Basil, optimistic, and I'm generally optimistic by nature in outlook, but a pragmatist in terms of analyzing what the situation is. Reality is, again, these are very deep structural issues, and there is no silver bullet or magic wand or whatever people like to call it around solving the problems of Egypt. And there's a huge disconnect between the hopes and aspirations of what people would like to see and what in reality can be delivered within a reasonable period of time, which poses a very significant challenge for any leadership, because a big part of any incoming leadership is around the journey that Egypt is going to have to embark upon in terms of trying to turn around its economy as well as go through a political transformation. And that's going to be a challenge. And I think it would be irresponsible to make false and naive promises. And I think that is part of and it would be irresponsible to be on the receiving end of the false and naive promises. It's going to be a tough journey. It's going to require some tough austerity measures. It's going to require some tough decisions around subsidies and other areas that need to be handled. And frankly, there's very limited flexibility to deal with these issues right now. If you look at the construction of the Egyptian budget and the expense items today, it's a challenge for any finance minister to deal with it. It's extremely rigid. Between public sector salaries, between interest payments, you've pretty much taken up half the budget. And if you look at probably the area you can play with around investments in other areas is less than 25%. I mean, one previous finance minister, who shall remain nameless, once told me, I always feel like I'm a quarter of a finance minister because that's the room I have to maneuver. Everything else is fixed. So these are deep issues, and I think those are issues that would require leadership, require taking people along with you on that journey. And ultimately what we need to do, and Egypt has been through periods of economic reform previously. I mean, if we look at the history of Egypt, post-Gulf War, we got the Paris debt relief, and in 1992, IMF reforms, big period of growth, and then a slowdown after that. In 1994, economic reform government came along, a number of measures were taken, you went through a significant period of growth, but then it came again with its challenges. And I guess the point I'm trying to allude to is that at this stage, you need to look at the quality of that growth. There is no point of having high-speed economic growth when you don't have the requisite social and political reform. Any economic reform agenda has to be extremely inclusive, has to include all segments of the society, has to be balanced, and has to be robust so it doesn't crack as it has at the time of 2011. And I think that is probably the key learning. And I think the world, not just Egypt, is recognizing today that we need to look at inclusive growth models. It's not just measuring the 6, 7, 8% GDP growth, but what is that quality? What is the quality of that 6, 7, 8%, and how is it distributed, and how sustainable is it going forward? So these are challenges Egypt faces, but these are challenges probably every country today faces, is how to create growth that creates the requisite jobs as well. So that's one of the issues we're looking at. In terms of opportunity, Basil sort of alluded to it as well. Egypt has a lot of the characteristics of some very significant growth markets. As a matter of fact, it wasn't too long ago that a Goldman Sachs reported it amongst what it called the next 11, N11, so included countries like Nigeria, Egypt, and others that were basically forecast to be the next growth engines of the emerging markets. And the reason Egypt has the capacity to do so is because it's a well-diversified economy to a very large extent, large population, young and growing population, so it has the potential to have a huge domestic consumption story. And if you look at some of the successful models that have happened with the emerging markets, it's not about primarily being an export story, it's about domestic consumption, and that domestic consumption is very real when you have a young population, average age sub 30, and a total population of 90 million. But that's that's two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, those 90 million present an opportunity as consumers. On the other hand, it's a challenge around how do you channel them productively and provide employment for those that come into the job market. So I guess that's what we look at when we look at Egypt. It's the consumer market. We've seen the spurts of growth that you get when you see the periods of economic reform that have happened in the past. In terms of what needs to be done, it's very easy to have a vision, and I think it's very important to have a vision. But what's more important is to have the ability to execute. And one of the challenges right now is we need to understand it's going to be largely about the economy. I mean, you alluded to the point again as well about if you don't have employment rates at sufficient levels, that's usually good enough reason to change leadership. And I think the way we would look at how this needs to be done is primarily around promoting private investment. The government is not going to be able to provide jobs for the Egyptians that are coming into the job market. It is not a practical solution. You can use it as a short-term measure, but it comes back to bite you. The only way out of this and promoting economic growth and promoting job creation is to encourage private investment, both local private investment and foreign private investment. And the first step in doing so is creating a level playing field, creating a good levels of governance, and the government recognizing the dynamic that's going to happen between what is the public sector involvement, what is the role of government as a regulator, how do we talk about the involvement of whether it's the public sector or the military or anybody else in economic activity vis-a-vis creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem that allows good businesses to rise to the top. So creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem, creating an ecosystem that supports small and medium enterprises, that allows good businesses to thrive, that provides access to capital, is going to have to be at the core of what's done here. And I think that will be the key challenge for any government that comes to rule Egypt at any point in time. So whilst I'll just close with a few remarks, and whilst the political transformation is key, economic reforms can simply not take a backseat. The demands of the January 25th revolution were about dignity, economic prosperity, and other aspirations, and these can only be met with economic growth. And it will entail some very tough measures from the political leadership, and will entail somebody with a lot of political capital to try and deliver this. We need to fix the educational system, you need to work on infrastructure, you need to create a capital markets that functions, you need to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem that encourages businesses to thrive. And only with a holistic approach to economic growth can this country go forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abdel. We'll turn now to get the perspective from the U.S. business community with Khush Chosky with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the U.S. Egypt Business Council. Khush?
Thank you. Thank you, Nelson, and thank you to the American Security Project for hosting this panel. What I'd like to do today is to focus on 5 key economic issues or changes that we feel Egypt should institute and are necessary. And I will speak from the perspective of American business. By ways of background, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to those that may not be familiar with it, it represents directly 300,000 American companies, and indirectly through our Federation of State and Local Chambers throughout the United States, we represent 3 million American businesses. In many respects, we are the home of American business. And we have, for the last 35 years, been the home of the bilateral economic commercial relationship. The U.S.-Egypt Business Council, which is housed at the U.S. Chamber, represents 50 American companies that cumulatively account for pretty much 98% of U.S. direct investment into Egypt. Earlier today, we had Amr Musa at the Chamber, where he unequivocally so. Last week, we hosted 2 forums in Egypt, one for the information and communications technology sector, the other with the pharmaceutical sector. And both of them are major players, sectors in Egypt, and certainly major major sectors for US corporate players. Clearly, we see a lot of reason to be optimistic about Egypt, but I will speak about what we feel are 5 broad challenges that Egypt needs to address. First, there needs to be a comprehensive economic policy. Second, there needs to be a reform of the bureaucracy and an urgent need for the wheels of the government to start working again. Third, we need to have a public-private sector dialogue. Fourth, we need international best practice instituted again, and the path that Egypt was at one time taking, coming back again. Fifth, we need the enabling environment of a government-to-government dialogue, certainly between the United States and Egypt on economic issues. And what I'd like to do is to spend a few minutes speaking to each of these. The first being an economic policy statement. The new president of Egypt needs to come out very clearly with what his vision for Egypt is, and comprehensively address and lay out to both the Egyptian and the international business community what they plan to do, certainly within the first 100 days and beyond, in their vision for Egypt. Secondly, and I think that we've seen a welcoming set of players in Egypt over the last year in this respect. The bureaucracy of Egypt had really reached a stage of stasis in our view over the last year. Prior to the last year, the wheels of government need to start moving again. And I think that we remain cautiously optimistic that the current set of players and the set of players that will run the ministries in Egypt have the track record and the capability to get Egypt moving again. Without it, all of their good intentions will not amount to anything. The third is there really has to be a genuine public-private sector dialogue. There needs to, Egypt at one point of time, if you go back 6-7 years ago, had started to build a culture of consultation. This needs to be reinstituted. Egypt being open for business is good, but there has to be a collaborative engagement with the Egyptian private sector first, and then with the international business community. Best practices. At one point of time, Egypt was identified by the World Bank in its Doing Business report as one of the top world reformers. Egypt can do that again, but it needs to once again look at intellectual property protection. It needs to move commercial disputes through its court system much faster, and it needs to do what it was doing before. Take a look at international best practice and start instituting those reforms across the board. And I think you will then start to see a greater level of confidence in the Egyptian private sector, followed by a greater set of confidence by the regional players, and then certainly by international investors. Lastly, and we allude back to the time when there was discussions of the US-Egypt Free Trade Agreement. We think through back to the time when there was what was known at that point in time as the Go Mubarak dialogue, and where Egypt had really started to step on the pace of economic reform. The absence of that certainly has impacted American business, and we would advocate for a strategic economic dialogue between the United States and Egypt, a rejuvenation of the US-Egypt Free Trade Agreement discussions, or some other vehicle that will serve as it has done in the past with Egypt. And you see that in many other countries where we have a dialogue between the two governments, it serves as a vehicle to bring together the concerns of the private sectors in Egypt and the United States. It serves as a tool that Egyptian policymakers can draw upon to institute the changes that they need to institute very quickly if they want to get Egypt back on the path of economic growth. Last but not least, we remain very optimistic about the path, in spite of the challenges. We remain optimistic about the path that Egypt will embark on and has embarked on of recent. We are holding a big international conference on October the 21st and the 22nd to highlight that, followed by a business mission to Egypt on November the 9th and 11th, where we plan to take American investors to Egypt and provide a platform for our companies to engage Egyptian business and government decision makers on what we feel will be a start of a productive dialogue. Thank you.
Good. Well, Khush, that's a very concrete initiative, bringing companies to Egypt, leading missions. Let me start off the questioning with a concrete question of my own. If Paul Hamill is in the room, maybe he could tell us how we're doing on timing, or if somebody could get a read for us. My question is this, and my colleague Ali Tulba at McClarty Associates, who helps us look at Egypt and the Middle East, has identified one of the key issues in Egypt is energy. Let me ask two energy-related questions. The first is, the government currently subsidizes fuel quite extensively. How long can the government continue subsidizing that fuel? What happens if they stop subsidizing the fuel? That's the first energy-related question. The second is, we're approaching summer. There are electric shortages already. How can a government continue to rule in Egypt if there are massive electric power blackouts, and how can that immediate problem be solved? Basil, let me start with you. Both of these issues are realities for you as a business owner and manager in Egypt.
I mean, I'm going to try to answer this the best way that I can, obviously. I guess you'd expect that of me. As opposed to the as opposed to the opposite.
A Harvard man will try.
And I'll probably maybe discuss a couple of other options. Yes, we have a fuel challenge. We have an energy challenge. It is not unexpected. If you take a look at the gas reserve analysis that we have, that was printed for or published by some of the independent consultants such as Wood Mackenzie, in which many of the international oil and gas facilities or LNG facilities have been financed on, it would have always told you that from 2013 to 2014, in that 24-month period, there would be a very serious energy crunch. That squeeze is the consequence of a lot of the offshore developments not going online. Now, of course, since the revolution, those developments have been pushed back. Instead of the squeeze lasting for 12 to 24 months, it's anticipated to last around 60 months now, including the last 2 years or so. What do we do in the meantime? And that's really the crux of the question. And Economics 101 will tell you subsidies are bad, you should take them off. We shouldn't have those. And I take a very pragmatic view on this, and I am probably the one contrarian who disagrees with everyone else. And so this is where I will now present to you my manifesto. Why shouldn't the government subsidize commodities for my citizens? Why shouldn't the government put forward these services? If you want to remove subsidies, you have to increase per capita income in a corresponding amount. If you cannot do that, you will have a very, very serious social problem. And this is the stark reality. Now, we can start having a discussion that we want to remove the price of gasoline. That's fine. Gasoline accounts for 6% of the total subsidy. So even if you take off the subsidy and you have it at international pricing, you're not really doing anything. You can talk about where is this subsidy coming from. It's coming in the form of electricity, and it's coming in the form of diesel, and that diesel and fuel oil combined. Not for the automotive, not for automobiles and trucks and what have you. our issue is a little bit more fundamental than that. And what causes me to be optimistic is that the solution is a pen. Egypt produces 77% of its electricity through natural gas. Natural gas in itself is a very, very valuable commodity. This is the highest ratio in the world. The second country after us is Nigeria at 55%, and third is Russia at 44%. Unfortunately, by having the Ministry of Electricity as a standalone entity, and without coordinating with the Ministry of Petroleum a blend of feedstocks for the power industry, we have seen this balance go towards that weighting. If you would have followed the media recently, you would have seen that there's a discussion that, yes, we will remove subsidies from fuel, but it will have to be done gradually and with time. And the reason it has to be done gradually is you have to ensure that you are creating jobs and that you are increasing per capita income simultaneously. If it stops, the outlook is not good. Let me talk about electricity, the second question that you have, which is electricity. And I always have a story. I deliver messages through stories. After the events in Fukushima in Japan, we have one of our partners is a Japanese company, and after the events in Fukushima, 4 days afterwards, I got on a plane and I went to Tokyo to visit them, to make sure that everything was all right, and I knew that this is something that would be expected of me as their partner culturally. And I came across two things. The first thing I was told is that our meetings would start at 6 o'clock. I was also told not to wear a tie or a jacket, and preferably a short-sleeved collared shirt. What I discovered is that office hours are from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. The days in which none of the lights in the buildings need to be turned on. There's enough sunlight. Number two, the air conditioning in every single building was turned off. Hence, the waiver for the tie and the shirt and the jacket. The nuclear power complex that was affected generated anywhere from 14 to 19% of Japan's total power requirement, and it went offline in a second. However, through measures like this, Japan was able to reduce their total power consumption by approximately 20 to 23%. And they were able to sustain the prolonged period in which they were able to put additional capacity online. The only way that we are going to get through this summer is with discipline. No other way. Because the reality is, the capacity that exists today is not sufficient. We have power plants that are currently under construction, but unfortunately, they will go online probably in the third or fourth quarter after the brutal period of summer. And from my perspective, I would hope that the government leads by example, because this sort of discipline can only be instituted if the government leads and it asks the private sector and the private citizens to follow.
Thanks, Basil. We have time for a few minutes of questions from the audience. Do we have someone with a microphone who can walk around? We'll go ahead and start with the gentleman in the white shirt and the blue tie. No, sir, behind you, sir. And please identify yourself. Let us know who you are.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Peter Koharis. I practice international law and advise governments and foreign investors in emerging markets. I'm also a visiting fellow at the American Security Project.
And it's good to see you again, Peter.
Thank you, Nelson. My experience has been in terms of in terms of investing in Egypt. A quick story after the first Egyptian Spring, a number of people I know in the region and I and others got together thinking that maybe we could cultivate some small and medium enterprises by creating a little investment fund, real frontier investing, and just try to develop some entrepreneurial small-scale projects throughout Egypt. And contacted a number of people who are very familiar with the region, and the blowback was rather surprising and disappointing. And the main criticism was, are you kidding? You can't do anything. You need government approval. Only big projects will get approved. Small enterprises are just too difficult to get off the ground, in addition to all the other problems that some of you have mentioned with respect to political risk and uncertainty and security, et cetera. So I wonder if some of you would talk about this from the perspective not of the large Exim, electrical generating hydrocarbon facility, but small and medium-sized enterprises and the ability or inability of finding entrepreneurs and cultivating an entrepreneurial class.
I can probably
Go ahead, Abdel.
speak to that. I mean, the bulk of what we do is growth capital, so it's a bit above the SMEs. But and we've done obviously a few large deals in Egypt, including a large fertilizer plant. But what we found in Egypt, generally speaking, is that there is, if you reach out there, there's actually a lot of fast-growing businesses in reasonably early stages that are starved for capital. And not just for capital, they're starved for partners, in the sense that a partner that will guide them on issues from governance to business development to other value creation levers that any business would seek as it embarks upon a growth strategy. And I think I would, from what we're seeing on the ground, and we've been observing this over a period of time, I'm actually quite optimistic about that sector, in the sense that the past few years we've seen a lot of activity. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are taking matters into their own hands. They are investing into their businesses. They are fighting against the odds. They are looking for partners in their growth. And I think what is starting to emerge as well is a bit of a culture of celebrating some success stories. And I think that is a very positive factor in and of itself. As you see businesses that succeed and raise capital and grow and get profiled, it encourages others to do more. And I think that's happening not just in Egypt, but across the Arab world, where there's a culture of entrepreneurial activity that's slowly emerging. We funded, quite a few of these growth capital businesses with relatively small tickets, and they've done quite well, actually, I have to say. Whether it was call centers or small services businesses, and they've done reasonably well.
Good. Well, that's go ahead, Basil. That's very encouraging, by the way.
I'd like to add just one more thing. To my colleague. Going back to the entrepreneurial programs or workshops that I had perhaps in the beginning, when I had said we need to have a dialogue to understand those. There is a stigma towards entrepreneurship. And I see that there's several people from Egypt and from the Middle East sitting in the room. And I can actually throw this question back. Would any of you, as parents, be comfortable allowing your 21-year-old child to forego employment at a company or at a hospital or an accounting firm or a law firm and to go off on his own and say, I'm going to start up a company and I'm going to rule the world? The reality is that is not acceptable, because that is not the way that we operate. When I started up my first company, I am not going to lie to you, the situation was at home was my parents, where our son has thrown away his future, and he went to Harvard, and look what he learned. He wants to set up a company instead of going to get a job, and this is a complete disaster. And then you had a scenario where my mother's telling my father, I told you we shouldn't have gone to the States, this is what they've done. The reality is, it needs work. And there needs to be a discussion as to how an entrepreneur ventures out into the world on his own without the adequate resources. If you take a look, and you mentioned Professor Porter, because he defined an entrepreneur perfectly. It is the pursuit of goals that you have no credible resources to achieve. This is the reality of what we do as entrepreneurs, but you need to be supported, and you need to have an environment that tells you, yes, go pursue your dreams, and by the way, it's okay to fail. And it's that last part that's complicated.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I think we'll take one question over here, and then the woman in the back row.
So I'm an executive in the technology business, and
yeah, tell us who you are.
Haitham Gadiri, and I work in the supply chain software business. So I get concerned from time to time when I hear government officials talking anti-margins. as if margins are a bad thing. When we go out for investment, whether we want to go, 2 years ago we opened an office in Shanghai because of margins. The talent was there, and it produced high margins, and we have to deliver high margins to our investors in the organization. And the U.S. economy have benefited throughout that. I mean, there's some opposition to outsourcing, obviously, and so forth, but we continue to grow our economy at that area outside of the banking segment. So do you also see that at one point, if you're attracting investors, you have to prepare a business model where you tell them you're, high volume, low margins, or high margins, low volume, and if there's no business model and economic models, investors are not going to come in. They have to make money. Do you see that as a challenge as well, from government thinking all the way and reality of bringing capital?
Good.
Thank you.
And while we're answering that question, we can move the microphone to the woman in the back. Go ahead.
Sure. I'll give you perhaps a different example from the government's, from what I perceive to be the government's position, or at least what I've read to be the government's position. Egypt currently employs the public sector employs anywhere from 6 to 7 million people. The private sector employs anywhere from 9 to 10 million people, approximately, somewhere in those ranges. And so the private sector, comprised of a large amount of individuals, are always looking at what the public sector, always looking at what the private sector is doing. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past is that the private sector has sometimes been a victim of its own success. And the reality is, and I'll put it to you in a different way. I, as the government, for example, sell you this bottle for $1, and you are to turn around and sell it to the consumers filled with water for $1.20, and you're making your margin. The moment that you start selling this bottle for $4, and you expect me to maintain the $1, you are going to create tension. Now, here in the United States, if it was between two private entities, the supplier of the bottle would just not comply with the terms of the contract, and our colleague, the lawyer, would begin to charge his hourly fees as this is litigated in court. A government will behave the same way, except for them to reach the decision that we need to stop. This doesn't make any sense for us. It will take them probably a significantly longer period of time. Now, what's interesting is that if you take a look at the text of the law, there are provisions under French law, which Egyptian law, as many of you are aware, is a hybrid of Napoleonic Code and Sharia. There are provisions that when performance of a contract becomes uneconomic for one of the two parties, that contract can be terminated or renegotiated. This is actually a provision in French law, which our law is based on. And this has been the basis in which the government has went forward. You need to make money as the private sector. That's ultimately your driver. And if you're publicly owned, that's even more of a driver, because the entire board will be reshuffled. And in Egypt, we hope that companies come forward and make money. But I think the government is also looking for these companies to give back to society.
Good, thank you. In the back.
Hi, my name is Samia Harris, and I do teach business, but I'm also an Egyptian entrepreneur, which you are correct. It surprises all my fellow professors, even here in the US, the Egyptian fellow professors. From your comments, I'm glad you are so optimistic. That's refreshing, because the indicators we see are very gloomy. It's really scary. You talked about the subsidy is necessary, but it's really applied in the wrong sense in Egypt, because it gives the billionaires the same right as it does to the lower income So we do have very simple ways here in the US to deal with that. You have the food stamp, the transportation subsidy to the lower income and so forth. Trickle-down economy did not work with Mubarak because it trickled but not to the right people. So all the middle class have now moved to the lower income class. So you have the upper and the lower, and you don't have the in-between that was created by Nasser. I'm sure you are following with the stock market, and the Egyptian money is running faster than anybody can even report it. And the Arab money are coming in. Yes, I do, thank you. The Arab money is the only funds that's going in. The corruption, can we really use it as a cost of doing business like they have done with the Nigerian model, which is really failing miserably as well? So tell me, there are two competitors now for the presidency, if you may. One is proposing that he will create 500,000 employment every year, which is less than 0.5% in a yearly basis, and you are saying has to be 3 to 6% at least for Egypt to come out of its trouble. And the other is proposing to give every youth 10,000 pounds, which is less than $2,000, which is, as from our experience in the US, giving people money just gets them to either have a party or pay their debt, so it doesn't go back to spending money in the economy. So please tell me, what are your real solutions? You being Harvard and all, you're wonderful, and what is the real essence of your optimism aside from the population growing? Thank you so very much.
Good. Okay, I guess that question is directed at me. being Harvard and all. Twofold. First of all, if you take a look at any developing economy, or any economy that has gone through a recession, what you will find is that when economic recovery begins, or economic growth, you can use both parallels, you will find initially that a certain group of individuals or private or public sector companies will grow exponentially, very, very quickly. This is what has happened in China, this is what has happened in Brazil, this is what has happened in Turkey. This is what has happened here in the United States in the early 1900s and shortly after the Great Recession. I mean, if you go back 100 years, you would have heard of, the Chase family and the Morgan family and the Rockefellers, and you'll actually find that they were 10 families, and the tap had turned on, and under the tap is a bucket. Now, the trickle-down economics require that bucket to be filled to the top, and then the water to start overflowing. This is how I describe, unfortunately, what's happened, is that as that bucket is being filled in Egypt, we have somehow managed to turn off the tap before that water starts to overflow. What we need to ensure happens this time around is that that tap is not turned off. Because ultimately, I want Abraj to come and invest. And I want Dante to set up a company in Egypt, and I want him to be extremely successful, because if he's extremely successful, that means he needs to hire people. And if he needs to hire people, that means that more people have jobs. I used to do, when I started the first project that we did, we used to do a very, very basic survey. We were interested to see how are we impacting the lives of our workers. And so we would send out this one-page questionnaire, and it would say, do you own a car? Yes or no? Are your children in public or private sector school? Do you own a microwave oven? And that was perhaps one of the most important questions, because the appearance of a microwave oven inside a home means that there is enough food on the table, and some is left over, and it is reheated. It is an absolute luxury. Whereas the lack of a microwave oven means that you're not unable to feed yourself enough every day, or there's never food left over. And what we found as a model...
Or you don't have electricity.
that is true as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what you do
But then on that basis, you wouldn't have a TV or a washing machine as well, and they do exist. The reality of the situation is that, do you subsidize the commodity? Or do you give cash to the people and let them spend it whichever way that they want? What you want to do is you want to try, I'm of the belief that the consumer or the private citizen is intelligent enough to decide what he should do with his own money. I don't believe the government should say, this is the price of chicken, and this is meat, and this is gasoline, and these are the prices, and if you don't use any of them, tough. This is what we're subsidizing. And you know, you're correct. Some people are going to go have parties in the beginning. But the next morning, they will be the lesson that is learned by everyone else as to what not to do with the money. Now, 500,000 jobs, we need more than that. I think it's a good minimum number to say, fine, but I'd like to see 1 million, I'd like to see 2 million, I'd like to see 3 million. I'd like to see our private sector reduced from 6 million to 2. Our public sector, excuse me. And I'd like to see the private sector increase by 4 million. Because if those people can be absorbed by the private sector, that means the private sector is growing. And if you want to have per capita income increase, what one should contemplate doing is increasing wages in the public sector and make those people more expensive for the private sector and make the incoming employees more expensive for the private sector. This is how per capita income starts to grow slowly but surely. Unfortunately, and I think my colleague had mentioned this, there's not one solution to any of our problems. We need to take a holistic, comprehensive approach. There is no silver bullet here. It is a series of reforms that need to be enacted over a short period of time that we will only see their fruits perhaps 36 to 48 months later at a minimum.
Well, there's been so much excitement in the questions and so much substance in the panelists' comments. We've gone way over our time, and I'm told that it's now time, despite the many hands in the room, it's time to end this session. So if you can help me thank our colleagues, Dante, Basil, Mustafa, and Khush, for a very fascinating panel. Thank you, gentlemen.